Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Prudence Carter. But before I do that, I want to recognize the people who helped to bring her here and organize this event. So the event was organized by our Diversity Action Committee, which is led by Dr. Antoinette Thomas. Could you just stand? So she and the other faculty and students and staff on that committee really deserve the credit for making the Ridley lecture happen. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Prudence Carter. She is, at the present moment, the Jacks Family Professor of Education, Professor of Sociology by courtesy, and Faculty Director of the John W. Gardner Center for Youth and Their Communities at Stanford University. Dr. Carter's research and teaching expertise are in the areas of inequality and the sociology of education, with a particular focus on race, ethnicity, class, gender, culture, and identity. She's the author of the award-winning book, Keepin It Real, School Success Beyond Black and White, which I use in my classes, and more recently of Stubborn Roots, Race, Culture, and Inequality in U.S. and South African Schools, which is related to the title of her talk today. She co-edited Closing the Opportunity Gap, What America Must Do to Give Every Child an Even Chance, and has authored numerous journal articles, book chapters, and essays. Dr. Carter holds a Ph.D. and a Master's in Philosophy and Sociology from Columbia University, an M.A. in Sociology and Education from Teachers College at Columbia University, and a B.S. in Applied Mathematics and Economics from my alma mater, Brown University. So I said that she is currently at Stanford. However, in June 2016, just a couple of months from now, Dr. Carter will become the Dean of the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley. So, yes. I will just say on the personal side, she has recently become a mentor to me on the project that you heard about. But really for a long time, you know, I feel like we all read other people's work, so she's been one of my kind of intellectual mentors for much longer than I've actually known her in person. She's a really very warm and caring woman. She's a mom, so she's wearing all of these hats, and what's critical to me is that she's doing really important work that relates to racial justice and thinking about how we create better opportunities and life experiences for youth. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Prudence Carter.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Joanna, for that warm welcome and introduction. I thank all of you for inviting me here to the University of Virginia. Thank you to the committee. I am quite honored to be here. I think this is only the second time that I'm giving a talk, a professional talk, in the U.S. South, and I'm a daughter of the South. I'm from the state of Mississippi. So this is quite, I always think, and I love visiting universities. Today I had the good fortune of talking to some of your undergraduates, fine undergraduates, Ridley scholars, and they gave me an earful about the history, the rich history of this place and what it means to them. So I stand before you today wanting to talk to you about some issues that are, I believe, of supreme importance to our nation and our global community. Should I hold off for a moment? Okay. As Joanna said, I am a sociologist. I'm a sociologist of education who focuses on large issues of inequality, but I do spend a lot of my time empirically at the micro and meso levels in terms of my research design to try to shed light on the connections and the things that are done every day that lead to some of the reproduction of macro level problems. So today I want to talk to you about the issues from the macro to the micro. And I'm going to start my talk off by talking about what I call 3 conceptualizations of inequality through the prism of race. And that is highly correlated with issues of class and poverty and wealth And so I'll spend some time talking about these issues at the macro level and bring them down to the micro level, and in the process incorporating the kind of research that I've done. And hopefully we will have a very rich discussion after this. I do try to be a provocateur, so please bear with me. I hope I don't ruffle any feathers, but I do believe that these things that I'm saying today are highly substantiated by data, by history, by politics. So the first thing that I want to do, I just actually want you to think about the conceptualizations that we have of race, and oftentimes we think of race just as an identity. But I'm talking about today a powerful social, historical, economic, and political phenomena. Phenomena, depending on how they were manifested over time, dynamic, deeply, deeply evolving, not static notions. They vary across the globe, but we'll spend more time thinking about ourselves here in the United States. And the first thing I want to do, just to get you situated, because I want to talk about this phenomenon as a socio-historical and a political force with accumulated material consequences that are deeply associated with the kinds of educational patterns and outcomes that we have in the United States. And so let me start by showing you something that grabbed my attention in the New York Times just a few weeks ago. It was actually sometime around January, and I thought, well, this is a powerful piece to be able to teach, because it shows what it looks like in terms of power and status in the United States across every major social institution, and what representation looks like. And here we go. As I scroll down this picture, hopefully you can see it. I have to get out of PowerPoint, I'm told. I have to reduce it and then bring it up. So bear with me for a second. Just minimize that. There we go. Okay. For those of you some of you may have already seen this, but this was a powerful piece for me, because these are the major social institutions, starting with our economy, the largest American companies in the country. There are about 100. Those whose faces are in yellow are the people who are considered people of color. And they're among the largest companies. There are about 8 of them out of 100, about roughly 8%. Here's the president and his cabinet, and I'll go on and tell you that this is perhaps the most diverse social institution in the U.S. right now in terms of who leads, who has the power and the position. Here are the presidents of the Ivy League universities. Here are our U.S. senators. Here are the Hollywood executives who choose which movies are made. The institution of the media is very powerful. I don't know how many of you do media cultural studies. These are the people who decide what music gets produced in the United States. The mayors of America's largest cities. The people who wield the most influence over which books we read. The powerhouses, the editors. The people who decide which television shows Americans see. We can see Ms. Shonda Rhimes there. She's quite a powerful force now. The people who decide what news gets covered. The United States Supreme Court justices. The governors of the 50 states of the United States of America. The top of military advisors. The owners of men's professional basketball teams. The owners of men's pro football teams. The owners of men's pro baseball teams. There are 503 faces I've just shown you. And of those 503, less than 10% were faces of color. in terms of racial and ethnic identity. It says a lot about who are the movers and shakers in this country, but we have a very strong mobility narrative about how people get to where they are. And often education is the social institution that we talk about and we use to explain why it is that we have the outcomes and we have the representation that we have among those persons. But I want to suggest to you that it's more than about education. And we have to deal with some of the accumulated consequences of de jure and institutionalized decisions that have been made in this country. And then we want to address how it is that education can become more of an equalizer in American society. Horace Mann talked about the social machinery of education, and education being an engine of equalizing opportunities. But there are many factors and there are many outcomes that are beginning to belie that dominant achievement ideology that if you just get a good education in American society, you can get a good job, and you can move into the various professional and managerial sectors, and then you can go on and perhaps become one of the power brokers in American society, or dare I say, global society. But it is not always the case that education is going to do that. And I wanted to suggest to you what are some meso-level and micro-level phenomena that are the outcomes or the consequences of the kind of foundational historical forces that we've had in this country, from slavery to conquest to colonization to Jim Crow to institutionalized forms of exclusion and discrimination in our schools, in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods, in the banking industry, that make it quite difficult for us to be able to say unequivocally that education is the key. I'm not going to suggest to you that it's not. I'm the granddaughter of sharecroppers. I don't think that my grandparents would have even imagined that their granddaughter, a little country girl from the Mississippi Delta, would be in 2 months the dean of one of the largest and one of the most major graduate schools of education in the country. Or that I would work my entire adult career at the most elite institutions, educational institutions in our country, or that I'd be educated there. So it has had some impact at an individual level. But as a sociologist, I look at intergroup, comparative group outcomes, and I want us to talk today about why those patterns are so stubborn and so rigid, why we can't break them in American society. And a lot of that has to do with day-to-day practices that are often intangible, and we don't pick them up in our surveys. We don't necessarily talk about them in our analysis, but we see the minors, canaries, and the symptoms, and the outcomes, and the disparities, the gross gaps that we talk about in education. So let me get to the meso and micro level, but before I do that, I'm just going to show you a couple of other things because they can get a little, perhaps that piece you might understand the faces of America in a different way. But let me show you some other things that my colleague Sean Reardon and his graduate students have found, just to tell you that race, even when we control for socioeconomic and class conditions, becomes its own independent and autonomous phenomena. It sustains itself, even when we say it's really about class in America. And a large part of it is about class, particularly when you see that 2 out of 3 African American, Latino, and Native American students are more likely to be born working class or low income or poor, within 200% or less of the poverty line. But let's look at this graph here, this particular graphic here, that shows what the neighborhood median income is for an individual who earns $20,000, $50,000, and $100,000, and this is by each race, major racial group in America. And you'll see that there are significant differences between those who are black, who are identified as Hispanic, white, or Asian, in terms of the median income in the neighborhood. even those who are upper middle class and who are African American and who are Hispanic, tend to live in neighborhoods, can you see the pointer? Not sure, you can't see it on there. Tend to live in neighborhoods that are more likely to be solidly middle class for those who are white and earn an average income of $50,000. And it's even higher for Asian Americans, and we can talk about the Asian American experience. That's a very large parent rubric. In many ways, a racialized category. We're talking about many immigrants who've come to this country with large amounts of human capital in the professional and managerial categories. And so there are some distinctions in terms of that story that we can't apply in terms of the logic that we apply for other racial and ethnic groups. But here's something, for me, that this suggests something very interesting. Even the everyday lived experience in terms of neighborhood, even once you're college educated or you're high income, is significantly different from your counterparts who are white and Asian in the United States, if you're black and if you're Latino. Here's another one. My colleague Sandy Darity, who is an economist at Duke, and Derek Hamilton, who's an economist at the New School, have been doing work at major cities around the country looking at the racial wealth gap. Here is an outcome of accumulated historical consequences, particularly when we think about the things that are foundation to the building of wealth and intergenerational passage of resources. What's most startling about this to me, based on 2013 data, is that when you look at those who are college educated, and the big rift or gap between those who are white, black, and Hispanic in terms of wealth, here is something that belies the great equalizing logic, the myth in some ways. We've known also for African Americans that even when they're college educated, that their wealth is significantly less on average in some of the studies that are shown than those who are working class white. And a large part of that has to do with housing and the appreciation of housing. And we know that the Great Recession had a very large impact on the African American and an even worse impact on the Latino community in the United States in 2008, 7, 8, and 9. So here we have these accumulated material consequences that make it harder for us to get away from the racialized patterns that I'm talking about. And then they get reproduced because there are some hard-hitting effects even as contemporaneous forces come into play, like the recession. But here's another conceptualization of race that I want you to draw your attention to kind of help us understand, well, why? What are some of the explanations? Even when we're playing the game, even when we're a part of the system. And this is where my own work comes into play. As I've tried to understand inequality, all forms of social inequality, I've been greatly influenced by a concept that I call relational inequality, and I'm influenced by the work of Linda Burton at Duke, who's a sociologist, my former colleague at Harvard in the sociology department, Michelle Lamont, and her students who work on social boundaries and how the everyday boundaries that we produce actually reinforce whether or not individuals and groups of individuals will be in or out of the modes of opportunity in American society. Lamont and colleagues talk about social boundaries as the objectified forms of social differences. So those are those markers of identity like race and ethnicity and class and gender that we talk about that often are associated with the unequal allocation of resources. But then, how is it that happens? And what this kind of research in relational inequality suggests to us at the micro and meso levels is that we as individuals, as human beings, when we're a part of groups, we utilize cultural tools to acquire status, to monopolize resources, to distinguish others, us from them. They play themselves out explicitly. They play themselves out implicitly. They play themselves out intentionally. They play themselves out unintentionally. But the end of the game is they can reproduce economic, social, and political inequality depending on how they manifest. And often that happens through some boundary maintenance in our social institutions. And I specifically want to talk about how we do that in schools today. So being influenced by that kind of work, I developed a conceptual framework in my own research as I went between two countries, the US and South Africa, both hyper-racialized societies based on the historical formations. And one of the things that I came to understand in this research is that while many of us focus on the material resource context of schooling to try to understand the individual and group level outcomes, and by the material resource I'm talking about school funding, the quality of teachers, the physical plant, the curriculum, the kinds of educational tools, et cetera, that many of us have created in the canon of educational research. Those things matter. There's lots of data support that. But I want to draw your attention to another aspect, which is what I call in my research the socio-cultural context of schooling. And that gets at the substance of relationships within schools. And those can be marked by the approaches of educators and educators and administrators and other personnel within school in terms of their approach to the inclusion of different kinds and different groups of students. It examines the kinds of interactions and attitudes that are pervasive and that permeate from the school communities, from the communities and neighborhoods inside of the school walls. It examines the type of social and symbolic boundaries that may be implicit in school codes or explicit in school codes and practices in the way in which the school is organized, the students' bodies are placed and located within the school. And I suggest to you that those things have a really strong association with how students will even select their academic courses, how they choose to participate in schools, how deeply they choose to engage in schools, the kinds of social networks they may form in schools. And we know from higher ed research that your social capital, that which inheres in your social ties, strong and weak, can have a very strong impact on your overall economic trajectory. The different forms of capital matter. But where we have not, as someone who identifies as a cultural sociologist, spent as much time, I would suggest, is really thinking about those micro-level interactions that are coupled deeply and interwoven and really help to reproduce. There is a symbiotic relationship that plays itself out. So I'm not going to just say this rhetorically. Let me try to show it to you empirically. And in most people, that's what we do in schools of education, as researchers especially. So the comments that I'm making today are drawn from a mixed methods project that was based on 8 case school studies. I went back to high school. From the years 2004 to 2008, I am not going back to high school anymore. It was, I actually went back to high school every day for 6 months in 2 different countries. I sat in different kinds of classes. I engaged in different kinds of techniques to collect data. Ethnography is very time intensive, it's body weary. But I followed and shadowed students from grades 8 through 12 in South Africa and grades 9 through 12 in the United States in 4 different cities, 2 here in the US and 2 in South Africa. In each city, I visited on a weekly level every other day or 2 days in a row, 1 majority minority high school and 1 white dominant high school. All of these high schools were high performing in their local context. I control for that. They were either rendered under the old NCLB system, level 4 or 5 schools. They were all of them were exemplary, or they went back and forth at some point. I'm only going to talk this afternoon about the U.S. schools. I can talk about the South Africa work that generally tends not to go over as interestingly to American audiences. So I tend to suspend that for various reasons. These data also come from interviews that I did, semi-structured interviews, group interviews of 3 to 5 students, and we conducted 57 of them across the 2 countries. And we also surveyed a random sample, a stratified sample of students in all 8 schools for a total of over 1,500 surveys. Here are the demographic traits of the U.S. schools. I call them using pseudonyms in the North region, North Capital City, North City Tech, which is a high-performing majority-minority high school. And it was perhaps the most ethnically balanced and diverse of the 4 schools in my study in the U.S. There is North Village Prep, which is a majority white school that had been participating in a voluntary desegregation program for more than 40 years. And in busing in low-income African-American and Latino students. South City Honors, which is one of the highest performing high schools in its local context, majority African-American. And South County Prep, which is 15 miles down the road, another high-performing high school, which was predominantly white but had about a 5th black students. One of the things that I should note is that in the northern cities, there were Latino students who I could include in the analysis, whom I could, but for the sake of today, I'm just going to talk about the data for the black-white comparisons because of the kinds of analysis that I'm doing. What did I learn? I talk about these boundaries and how these boundaries can be linked to the macro level. But staying at the meso level, one of the things that was most startling to me as I moved through school spaces every day, surveyed students, interviewed teachers, sat in classrooms, was watching how every day we can produce lines, as the kids call them, how we learn our lines. And they are real or they are symbolic, and we see them mirrored in school practices. Here is Ashley, an 11th grade female student from South County Prep, who actually tells us explicitly how she learns her lines. We have like a kind of lot of blurry lines, like you can have that group and you can't relate to the group, but you can individually, but not the whole group. But a lot of the other groups, they've just learned their lines a lot. Like we have a lot of people that are in the AP classes and they hang out together. And then there's like the theater groups and stuff like that, and they hang out. Just an excerpt. What I learned at South County Prep from Ashley and her peers was that there had become the phenomena where certain groups were associated with certain kinds of classes. AP and honors were to the white students. Baseball and basketball were to white boys and black boys, as cheerleading and stepping were to white girls and black girls. The school had become racialized even in the essence of its activities. When I walked into this particular school, there were 292 African American students, some of them middle class, some of them working class, some of them poor. The same for the white students. I chose to sit in every type of class in those schools, and what I could not find was teachers or students who could name more than 3 African American students whom they thought were high achieving. And I wanted to understand that phenomenon. How is it that students who came from similar backgrounds and attended a school just 15 miles down the road, and some of them had siblings in this school, those students 15 miles down the road at South City Honors, where I saw students who were African American in baseball, in Model UN, in debate, in the chorus, in AP honors classes, in IB classes. Perhaps their test scores for the school on average wasn't as high as that at South County Prep, Ashley's school, but they were represented across the spectrum in every activity the school had. And I needed to understand, how is it that you could have similar groups of students from similar racial and socioeconomic backgrounds having radically different experiences just 15 miles apart? And what I discovered is that it had something to do with the mindsets and the viewpoints of educators about who is in, who's out, what's actually what's appropriate for some groups and what's not appropriate for some other groups. So I started to think, is this an issue of flexibility? Is there something social psychological going on? Is there something in the water, in the ethos, and the essence of the organization of the school? And let me step back for a moment and say, in my first book, Keepin It Real, School Success for Black and White, I ended on a point where I'm talking about and arguing how I think it was important for educators to cultivate multiple cultural currencies in all kids. And that the educators themselves needed to do that we all needed to engage in something I call multicultural navigation if we wanted to diminish those boundaries that play up, that rear their ugly heads along the lines of race and class. But I hadn't really studied the process of multicultural navigation. This was an implication from some of the research that I'd done. So in this study, I decided to think about what is it that makes an individual willing to cross those social boundaries and to participate in terms of their interactions with another, as well as in terms of their engagement with certain spaces in the school. What does it take to have a flexible mind? Evitar Zerubbabel, some of you may know him, he's a sociologist who thinks very much like a psychologist, in some ways a social psychologist. And one of the arguments that he's made is that progress of society, and I put in brackets, and schools, flows from the flexible mind, not the rigid-minded or the fuzzy-minded. Meaning, it's this idea, and if I have to get, in some ways metaphysical on you, because I actually believe it, this idea that if we have these strong structural boundaries, these mental structures in our mind that allow us to create us from them or otherize different groups, that would inhibit the ability to fully incorporate all within a space, particularly a space that's supposed to be mobile, that's supposed to be germane or conducive to upward mobility, like a school. And rigid-mindedness can impede that process. Flexible-mindedness can facilitate the process of incorporation. So I decided to examine this notion of flexibility by asking, we surveyed these 1,500 students. I'm just going to talk about the U.S. students. There were 650-something of them who completed the survey. And here's what we asked them. Would the following characteristics of a person make a large or small difference in whether or not you would become friends with another student? We asked about gender, race, and ethnicity. We asked them about, speaking standard English. We're trying to get at slang. And so as an ethnographer who studies adolescents, one of the things that I learned is when you survey adolescents, use their language. And so I started to use their system of meanings. What matters to them? So I asked about cool clothes. I asked about music. I asked about whether or not you perceive the person as nerdy, listen to rap music, listen to rock music. These are the kinds of things that would come out in our interviews around students' taste, popular cultural taste, and how they associated that with their identities. And so this is what we included in our survey. And we then tried to predict what were some of the things that would actually lead to higher or lower cultural flexibility, becoming friends with different kinds of people in the composite. And here are the things that we control for, and here are the things that we use to predict. So let me show you some of the results. On a whole, what we found for the entire sample, starting from the bottom, is that those students who had preferences for same race peers and same SES peers, both in schools and living in their neighborhoods, reported lower levels of cultural flexibility. That's not rocket science. That kind of makes sense why that would happen, right? We also found, for the entire sample, that those students who were enrolled in AP and honors classes were showing higher levels of cultural flexibility than those students who were not enrolled in such classes. We asked about AP, IB, honors, so these are all folded within this particular category. Now let me tell you something. Having sat in different kinds of classes and gone back to high school, I now have a bias towards certain types of classes. When I went back to high school, I was sitting in some classes in high school where kids were babysitting worksheets. I was sitting in other classes where they were doing the most phenomenal activities, and I needed to go back to high school for real because I was learning something. They were such vibrant contexts. The kids were working collaboratively in these groups. Those were the kinds of classes, and regrettably, they were more likely to be AP and IB classes where the kids who needed it the most, many of the kids who needed it the most were not located. When we disaggregated these data by race, we found that the white students who lived in North Capital City reported higher levels of cultural flexibility than those who lived in South Capital City. We suspect that that has something to do with the regional dynamics and how the racial ethnic relations play out in those particular cities. And in fact, students will tell us about how they could actually diminish those boundaries in schools in South City Honors, but they couldn't take it home. For black students, and here's where it emerged in a kind of a paradoxical way for us in the findings, we found higher levels of cultural flexibility among the students who were attending the majority minority schools than those who were attending the majority white schools. Now, if you think integration is doing its job, wouldn't you think it would go the other way? Well, why wasn't it? We also saw that self-esteem was a positive indicator of cultural flexibility, and it was the fact that those black students who were attending the majority minority schools showed higher levels of self-esteem than those in the majority white schools. That's consistent with previous research. That's not a new finding, actually. There are some findings that came out, and I can suggest to you that that has something to do with the cultural conditions of the school. That is not to do necessarily with something essentially different about the students themselves. I'm going to speculate and I'm going to tell you why. I've already told you some of the things, but let's keep going with the data. Here's a really interesting interview excerpt because this is what comes out of some of this work. These young men, Judah, Jarvis, Jonathan, and Marcus, attended the most affluent high school in the study. They were a part of that group that was bused. This is a desegregated high school in North Capital City. And they had a debate in front of me one day. These are all black boys. Judah was complaining. He says, the system doesn't encourage us to interact. Think about it. Jarvis says, well, why should we interact? Jonathan says, yeah, why? Marcus, why do you need to be encouraged, Judah? You have some agency. And Judah says, because the VDP, the Voluntary Desegregation Program, is not just about coming out to suburban schools, doing the homework, and going back to our homes. The VDP program is about teaching suburban schools, suburban students, what it's like to live in the inner city, what it feels like to be a person of color. It's about, Jarvis cuts him out. I thought that the purpose of the VDP was to come out and get a good education. Jarvis takes a rational and instrumental approach to education. Marcus and Jonathan agreed, yeah. Judah says, no, it's not. Well, that's his main purpose, but the other purpose is to teach each other what we have to offer. And then this young man who's become my research muse goes on to say, I'm referring to like the intangibles, not whether or not you can reiterate the facts that the teachers are teaching you, not whether you can memorize like a math equation or a scientific formula. I'm talking about character, strength, and integrity, and how we relate to each other, how we identify with other people, and our creativity. Those are the things that I feel are not being valued enough in the school system. The way the system is structured now, they solely focus on, what grades you get. And I think that doesn't do us much justice. End of quote. In this particular high school, the students were grappling on a day-to-day basis about fit and belonging. And for those of you in social psychology, you know what the research my colleagues Greg Walton and Jeff Cohen have shown us in their experiments about the relationship, feeling like you belong to a place, and the impact on the educational outcomes. These particular students in one of the most resource-rich schools in the country where 90+% go on to selective colleges and universities, except these kids. But the other kids in the school, the white and Asian kids, these particular students reported significantly lower cultural flexibility. These are not the kids who were participating and deeply embedded in the school to the extent that the school could actually realize. And the question is why? This is what I want to suggest to you. My colleague David Lavery has written an article that's deeply influenced my thinking. And so now I use this when I give talks to try to understand and unpack this research. Lavery has argued that there are so many tensions among the approaches to schooling. And there are three dominant ones he outlines in this 1997 American Educational Research Journal article. There is the kind of economistic approach to education, which has been about making sure we have the most vibrant, productive economy, and by cultivating human capital, being most efficient, and cultivating human capital to prepare the kinds of workers we need to sustain the economy. That's a very big perspective, particularly among economists, and I would say probably the mid-20th century and so forth. That was a really, really big idea. Lavery argues that where we are now is the most prevailing notion of schooling is the one of social mobility. And this notion of social mobility is that we're preparing our children to compete against one another for social status and resources. And oftentimes that competition evolves and it supports a logic that renders education solely as a private good for individual consumption. It engenders processes that fuel and foment things like separation, segregation. I want to live in these neighborhoods because these are the best schools, and I need my child to get the best scores so that they can go to the best colleges, so that they can get the best jobs. Consequently, each of us colludes in the process of a phenomenon that social scientists are showing repeatedly that reproduces the kind of massive macro-level forms of inequality in American society. Education as a private good. Social efficiency, the argument, Lavery says, was really utilizing education as a public good. The democratic equality perspective is about education as a public good because it focuses on education as developing citizens who will go on to produce a very strong and healthy democracy, who will work with each other across different lines of difference. And our schools don't do that today. Our schools are preparing individuals to be individuals to compete against one another. And so what do we get? Let me go back to Judah and Jarvis's and Marcus's school. We get a school, and we get schools that oftentimes not only treat education as a private good, but they become colorblind and color mute when they see certain kinds of patterns going on in the schools. So that we get the South County highs where you don't see very many high achievers and you don't find educators actually, they're worried about it because NCLB at that time, they were getting a score and they needed to make sure all the subgroups were going to perform well too. But they didn't have to perform well enough to be in the high achieving college prep type courses. They didn't have to necessarily attend to the fact that the students there had significantly lower self-esteem as black students than their peers down the street, or that they were segregated by the activities that would be conducive to their actually getting on the college readiness, college interest, college preparedness track. We also find that in those schools where the boundaries are so stark, that they didn't pay attention to the fact that diversity is neither integration nor inclusion. You can have all the bodies and the representation there, but then you can also create segregation within the school so that you create fundamental differential outcomes for different social groups of students. And this is what happened at South County High. And to an extent, this is what happened at Judah's School at North Village Prep. But North Village Prep, or North Village High, excuse me, I get them confused sometimes. North Village High, while they had some patterns of segregation within schools, they chose to actually get away or do away with AP classes in English and history. But here's the irony. Going back, just thinking about Labourie's Education for Social Mobility. They did not do away with AP classes in English and history to create a more equalized experience for our group of students. They did away with it, as I'm finding in affluent communities across the country, to diffuse the competition among their white upper middle class Asian students and white students so that they could be competitive, equally competitive with each other as they applied to universities like this one and the ones where I teach. And so, you know what happens is you weight the AP classes. The more you take, the higher your GPA. And the parents who had the political and cultural capital were complaining. So the principal and teaching staff decided to do away with those courses to benefit their students in that manner. Education as a private good. Now, you can argue it trickles down, must have had some impact, that way all the kids were in similar kinds of classes. But I want to tell you, they actually weren't in all the same kinds of classes. When I walked through North Village High, which was actually very much like a course catalog in a college university, I remember one day looking at the different classes and thinking, where am I going to go today? Where am I going to high school today? And there was this wonderful class on gender in ancient Greek society. I certainly didn't have that in college even. I'm sure it was there, I just didn't know about it. So I said, let me go and take this class. And I said, I'm going to take Mr. fill-in-the-blanks class. And I had an educator say to me, Mr. who? And I said, I'm going to take this class. It's on gender and ancient, I think it was ancient Roman society. And she said, well, our kids don't take anything like that. The kids being the VDP students. They had demarcated classes. For who? For the black kids and the Latino kids. They couldn't be interested. And similarly, when it came to things like, and here's another thing, when for 2 weeks, 10 days, they took 100 students to Japan as a part of the orchestra, our kids didn't do anything like that either. There was not but one black child to be found on that trip. And he had 2 white mothers. And he lived in the local neighborhood, in the local community. These are the mechanisms to broadening one's cultural and social horizons, are they not? And so now I was starting to understand my survey data findings as I became more immersed in the ethnography. That there were, even within this rich material resource context, I was seeing a very different socio-cultural, different kind of cultural ethos, a different way of organizing students within the schools, which for me would suggest why there were some different kinds of outcomes. Why, when I went back the following year, I could only find among those who were members who were seniors and graduating who were a part of the VDP program, only 4 of them were off to college. And they sent 90+% to selective colleges and universities. So where do we go with that? What do we do? I call these the limitations of liberal ideology of schools and communities. These 3 things: education as a private good, color blindness, class blindness, color muteness, as the anthropologist Michael Pollitt talks about, the equal treatment approach where we can treat everybody the same, but we're actually not paying as much attention to the structured nature of race and class as it plays out in our schools. And then we get into debates philosophically, resource-wise, as to whether or not we should be doing equality or doing equity in our schools. And I ask the question, is one more just than the other? And I want to suggest to you, based on my own observations, based on my own social location, based on my own understanding as a sociologist, that one is, if we're going to try to change those macro level patterns that I talked to you and showed you pictures of in the beginning. We have to ask ourselves, how do we get to more radical inclusion in schools? And drawing on the work of a British researcher named Lynn Barton, I love this quote, he studies special education. He says inclusive education is not concerned with the assimilation or accommodation of discriminated groups or individuals within existing socioeconomic conditions and relations. Rather, it is ultimately about the transformation of a society and its formal institutional arrangements, such as education. This means a change in values, priorities, and policies that support and perpetuate practices of exclusion and discrimination. I think we can learn something from some of our high-performing majority-minority schools, actually. Here is a scene from one of them. South City Honors, which is 15 miles down the road from Ashley School. Kate Gilman, who was the ACT Star Teacher of the Year, this is a pseudonym, of course. Here's a class, the second period, 22 students, 14 black females, 3 black males, 2 white females, 3 white males. Actually, the white students, many of them were likely to be the children of some college professors. There was a local college, a very nice liberal arts college in the area. And many of them, because of the history of this school, sent their children to the school. But it was mostly African-American dominant school. You saw Xavier, the African-American male. He was one of 2 national achievement semifinalists in the senior class. There was Benson, a white male who was the high school valedictorian, had a perfect score on the ACT. And this is what I loved about being in that class and in that school, something I didn't see at South County High. Today is AP practice test focus, and Miss Gilman walks around. She passes out these cards. These kids are working on an activity. I couldn't do the work. I was really struggling, but at the one time she was like, you've got it correct, you're a genius. If you didn't have it correct, you can get it correct. I know that Carol Dweck was here, just keep working, you know, growth mindset. So she was doing these things, and I could see why she could become a star teacher, this kind of rich engagement. And these students, these African-American students, were not upper-class students. This school had a high percentage of free and reduced lunch students. Well over 3/4. But this is the kind of scene. This is not the other school. I can go back. It didn't come up. North City Tech. This is a school where almost all of the kids were working class or poor. This is a class that's fairly racially mixed. It's balanced in terms of gender. The kids are collaborative. They're sitting at tables. The black male, he walks into the room. He gives pounds. You know what that means. Handshakes to a whole group of boys. They seem to work across race and gender. I'm watching this, supporting one another as they're working on these assignments. The boundaries were very thin, if any. Why didn't I see that at North Village Prep? Why didn't I see that at South County Prep? So I want to kind of wrap up, because I've been talking for a while, by talking about what I think are some of the solutions. Multidimensional problems of inequality, educational equality, economic and social equality demand multidimensional solutions. At the macro level, as an inequality scholar, and Sean Reardon and I have really spent a lot of time in the inequality research, we produced a report for the William T. Grant Foundation thinking about where does inequality research need to go given what we know. And I suggested to you that it's time for us to think more ecologically and interdependent in terms of social institutions. Education cannot do it alone. I don't believe it can. It is time for us to work in multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary teams where we can think about what kinds of job policies, what kinds of things that we can do to really work in terms of interventions to reduce the accumulated disadvantages that exist in our society. What are the kinds of things that we can do to create a more fairer and stronger democracy where there's more shared power, and that the next time, maybe 50 years down the line, when the New York Times does a graphic like it does, it looks very different and it represents the mosaic of the United States. in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, class, all of the different categories that matter to our day-to-day lives, where political power is not highly correlated with economic power, where we can think about how it is that we bring about, create livable jobs for all these families so that the home life is stable, and that those issues that confront so many poor children today don't permeate the walls of the schools, because I do know that those things also matter. The research is showing us more and more, and it has an impact earlier and earlier, so that we can think about how to actually create those mixed income, racially mixed neighborhoods and housing, because the reality is, I just saw a report yesterday that even if you're a black homeowner and you're middle class and upper middle class, it's not a good investment to own a home today. We saw what happened in the recession. This is what I just read in a study yesterday. Because segregated neighborhoods don't yield, when they're black and brown, don't yield the same kind of appreciation as white segregated neighborhoods. How do we create the kinds of affordable banking and savings programs? Many of the poor now don't use our banks. I have a colleague at the Russell Sage Foundation who's looking at how many low-income people use these everyday payday lending places that charge these enormous percentages for folks to cash their checks. People don't have their money in the banks, our mainstream banks. All of these things matter to the quality of the lives of people. They're big things. They're macro things. They're not things they're not things that we can't conquer or overcome, provided that we have the political will. How do we recalibrate the wealth distribution in this country? I may be sounding like Bernie Sanders. I do think he has something here. And I'm actually not committed to anyone just yet. But we do have to think about how to recalibrate the wealth distribution in this country. Wealth matters more and more, I'm beginning to see from the economics research. 74% of all the wealth in this country belongs to the top 5%. This is from data from 1983 to 2010. And I will say, and this is another talk, but I'm just going to put it up there just to be provocative. I think we have to end mass incarceration. The impact, and this is where there's shared partisanship. There's partisan agreement on this. The impact of mass incarceration on the family, more than 2/3 of those who are in state and federal jails are actually high school dropouts. We spend 5 to 6 times in most states on incarcerating these individuals than we do on educating these individuals. It's not the most economically efficient thing to do. So these are the kinds of things that we must pay attention to at the meso level. And I'm going to say this one again. I think it is important for us to think about how we shift the mindsets in our institutions, our organizations, and at the individual level about how we treat education as a private good. Schools and other social institutions are part of changing the mindsets, building empathy, dissolving boundaries, cultivating the social, civic, and kind of economic engagement across social lines that will have long-term impact on the trajectories of all of our kids. These things matter. The research matters. If we look at it holistically, even though we're all a part of different disciplines, you put all of these things together, you see how they fit. It's an ecological problem. And at the micro level, it is in time for us to think about how we erase prejudice and bias and fully incorporate these different groups of kids in every educational space, making them all rich. So that education is, if it is a private good, it is also a public good, because in the ultimate forms, it has benefited our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very powerful and thought-provoking presentation. So I would like to open it up now for some questions. We have a few minutes. to entertain some questions. So I will be the deliverer of the mic.
Thank you very much for that very compelling talk.
Thank you.
So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more specifically about the distinction between making institutions more inclusive and transforming institutions, and perhaps by giving an example of a practice that would make a school more inclusive versus a practice that would transform the culture or the policies of a school.
Mhm. So, is my microphone on? I actually think that inclusion, as I define it, and inclusion not just being representation, but a deeper incorporation of groups in every facet of the life of a school, is a part of the calculus of transformation. So let me just say that first, conceptually. That's how I conceptualize it. There are three things that I think about in terms of fully incorporating and getting to what I call true inclusion or true integration. And true integration is not my term. I've been influenced by the thinking of a legal scholar named John Powell. There's a sociologist, Bill Trent, who's written some things about this. I think, one, in terms of the inclusion, we have to be so vigilant about patterns that are correspondent to forms of inequality. I think many times in some of the practices, until I did this work, I thought a lot of this was innocuous. You know, it was innocent, it's unintentional. People are not even conscious. Kids will just be kids, teachers will just be teachers. But there are some educators who witness and who are conversant with literature and research who's like, I don't think we want to encourage those kinds of patterns. So let us do something. And one of my schools attempted to do this by first understanding that there were huge cleavages among different social groups. It decided to incorporate a practice where it started. This is actually a South African school, but I'm going to talk about a U.S. school because I think they were both doing something, but the U.S. school was very young in this process. When I first went to South Africa in 2004, I met a school counselor. We were just 10 years post-apartheid. And I met a school counselor who said, we've now rapidly opened these schools. And in South Africa, the desegregation process really mainly only happens among the middle class because you have to pay fees to go to school. They don't have the property tax assessments, you pay fees. So you can stratify schools economically there. Although there are some poor and working class students who work for a wealthy employer, and the employer may send the kids to those schools. Okay, so what this counselor did is said, I'm going to start a retreat for 3 days where I'm going to take a third of the sophomore class, they don't call them sophomores, grade 10s, on a weekend retreat. And we're going to break through some of these boundaries, some of these things that these kids think about each other. And they're going to be in this intimate space in this retreat. It's a very small pilot program when she started it. I was just back there in 2012 teaching in Cape Town. And now the entire sophomore class just about goes, a grade 10 class goes on this program. And this is what I hear these kids talking about. I used to think that Nkosi and her people, when I would say this, I used to think X, Y, and Z. I won't say anything about that. But you know, after I did the diversity trippers thing, I've totally changed my mind. Now, sometimes I hear Sarah say things, and I now say, you know, that's just not right. We should probably think about it that way. And so now I say things to my friends, but I don't want to judge my friend. I just want to tell her, you know, I just don't think that's not right. This is why I don't think it's right. And now you hear this dialogue, these children in a new generation who are starting to have a very different relationship to each other in school. I walked through this school, and I've never seen this in the U.S. schools, actually, where they have theater. Theater is very big in one of my schools. The most gorgeous photographs around the school of these kids from all these different backgrounds acting intimately together in theater. Art that represents all the different cultures in that country. There are 8 official languages. You have kids, they're learning English, Afrikaans, and Xhosa. You have, now here's the last bastion. It's not completely transformational, and this is part political. The teaching workforce has not been diversified at all. But you have teachers who realize if these are the populations, they're changing their minds. The principal's saying to me, I've been in these classes, I've been in these workshops. You know, I used to think, because this school had a policy where it was illegal or a kid could get a demerit if they wore their hair like mine is in the poster for this particular talk. And I was trying to understand why is it that they would actually make it actually against the rules to wear ethnic hairstyle. He said, I used to think that was wrong because there was fear that the white kids would actually want to wear their hair like that. And they didn't want that cross-fertilization culturally. He said, but we've changed our minds about that. Now everybody can wear their hairs like that. And if they want to have those little elastics in their head where they look like Christmas trees, this is what he's saying, because he said that the finer hair wouldn't hold like the kinkier hair. So he made a joke out of it. But it's moving from this kind of fear of the other and the othering of the other to dissolving those boundaries so that you can be truly reflective of South Africa in its principle of being inclusive. Now, whatever you may think of its political and economic situation, that's one thing, but this is what was going on socioculturally. Now, here in the United States, North Village Tech tried something like the diversity trippers, but it wasn't an overnight. They brought in a program where teachers and students would spend the entire day trying to break down barriers. They were committed to trying to figure out how to get at the engagement, belonging, and achievement disparities in some kind of great way. They had great teachers there. I think one of the things that was harder for North Village Prep was how to deal with also some of its class privilege issues. They just got in the way. So there was no thinking, if we take kids to Japan or to Asia or to Latin America, because they went all over the globe with their extracurriculars, then maybe we think about, we know we can raise the money or endow, but maybe we think about how we can subsidize and get a lot of these other kids whose families can't afford to send them. And those were the kinds of things so that's where they had to go in some ways. And I think that requires thinking more empathically, less selfishly or self-interestedly. It means being more altruistic. And I think that's where we still have to go. So education is a private good. I don't know if that answers your questions. These were schools trying to transform themselves. And it doesn't happen in a year. And over the course, in the South African case, it happened over the course of 8 years, I think, as I saw this program. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Carter. Thanks again for being here. We appreciate your words. Thanks to Antoinette and the committee for bringing you in. I'm Paul Harris. I'm here on the faculty in Curry, and I have a question that I think might be similar to Rachel's, and if there's some overlap, maybe we could extend it in some ways that adds a bit. But been recently having conversations with colleagues, particularly at the University of Connecticut, where they've created the Scholars House learning community for black males, and other colleagues in DC who are creating a high school similar to that of Urban Prep in Chicago for black males. And I'm curious, as I listen to you talk about public and private good and cultural flexibility, how you would situate efforts like that within the framework that you presented today.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that when I showed, ordinarily when you know, it's interesting, for the first few years when I was presenting, even when I was in the research and I was doing preliminary sharing, I would forget about the majority minority schools. I spent less time on what was going on in them because I was so busy trying to talk about the resource-rich schools and what was happening as they were diversifying. There's a lot to be learned about schools like Urban Prep and other places that are monoracial or monoethnic or single sex. What's going on in those schools that actually facilitates the sense of academic efficacy, that builds self-esteem, that makes a student feel much more agentic, so that they engage and they're embedded and they subscribe to education, to the culture of the school and wanting to do well in a better way. And there are things to be learned in those school contexts, which is why I showed that slide. It's that for me, that's what I learned, like how, which is why that sociocultural part really emerged inductively as I was immersed in my data analysis. It's like, look at what's so different. Why is it so much richer here? And why am I not experiencing it here? I was even thinking about my own body, like how I felt when I sat in those schools. And so to answer your question, I think there's enough in the educational landscape for us to have heterogeneous models of schooling. I don't think all schools have to be that way. I do think that those schools play a really rich role. Scalability is often an issue for really innovative models, even like the Harlem Children's Zone, for example. So we're not going to have all the schools. There are over 13,000 districts, right, in this country. We're just not going to be able to do that. And I also think that separate will never be fully equal. It just never will be. And in that case, I don't mean it separate in terms of, I'm talking materially here, because in that case you have the kind of grant making, foundation support, you have the kind of infusion of resources that make it possible. They're smaller schools, but when you start to scale these things, or you start to think, well, we need all black this, boys schools, and you try to make them traditional public schools, and it's based on public dollars, it will not play out the same. I can probably guarantee you that. So I think we have to be careful that way. In terms of a public good, or private good, I think most schools right now, most parents, most of us think of education as a private good. That's what's salient and central for us. I'm actually trying to figure out how we do both, private and public. Like, you know, there's something for me, but there's also what I'm doing for the society. How am I thinking about my neighbor and my neighbor's children? How am I thinking about this municipality? How am I thinking about the state? How am I thinking about the rest of it? How do my actions, if I interrogate my own actions and I'm being reflexive, how do my actions on a day-to-day level either minimize that to the degree that me as one person can do that, or reproduces it? That's all I'm thinking. That's what I'm thinking about. Is that too idealistic? But I think we have to be radical in our values and priorities if we really want to change. Otherwise, we'll stay the same, and we'll all still be employed doing inequality research on the same old questions 50 years from now. That's what I think. Yeah.
Other questions? Question?
When you talked about the minorities and their feeling when they were a minority in the school, majority minority, no, when they were in a majority white school, and they had a feeling of low self-esteem. When you flipped that and you were in the minority school, were the then by numbers minority having a low self-esteem because they were in a small number? Like, were the white kids at that school having a low self-esteem?
That's an interesting question, because they're actually in one of the schools, when we disaggregate, when I look at the self-esteem data, I don't want to get it wrong, it's in my paper, I'm trying to remember. In one of the schools, we actually saw a pattern. It was consistent across all four schools, the two schools for the black students. The minority of white students, there was one school that was multi-ethnic, the most multi-ethnic and multiracial school. There were some white students who struggled with being the numerical minority in the school. These are working class white students who were in a high-performing, this is a high-performing, one of the city's high-performing schools, highest performing schools. And they had actually, this was, I think part of it was because they were being introduced. This young woman talked in an interview about when she sits in a history class, the teacher was an African-American male and he was centering African-American history. And she said, I'm used to understanding history this way. So she was being pushed in a way, her knowledge boundaries were being pushed in a way that she was uncomfortable from elementary school or from what she heard at home and stuff. So she did talk about that. whether we saw those, we didn't see statistically significant differences in self-esteem for white students. I would have reported that. We did have a few students talk about, or, you know, sometimes I realize that I'm one of the few white students at South City Honors, which is one of the schools, and we realize that we're some of the few white students, and the black students tease us. You know, they'll tease us for our style because they had different styles, or they'll say, you know, they'll say things to each other. This particular, there was one young white male, I tell this story because it's poignant. He was being recruited for a baseball scholarship at a local college. He went to this black high school. He had a black girlfriend. He ran into the coach in the mall, and he was supposed to have an interview, and he never got the call. And he thinks it's because he introduced his girlfriend to the coach. I can't prove that. So you had stories like that. They're thinking that maybe some of this was about their privilege in the larger world, or how they saw themselves in the larger world, how that might have been countervailed by being a part of this black school setting. But it didn't show up in the survey data as a significant difference in self-esteem. These were stories told to us. And I hope that answers your question.
There's a question back here.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. Nice to meet you. My name is Christina. I'm a first-year Ph.D. student in the School of Nursing. And currently, they're transitioning from a traditional application review system to a more holistic review to try to change the way diversity looks in the School of Nursing. And I was just wondering, how does this affect the mindset of new students coming in, knowing that there's a new application approach? Do they question their ability to be in this setting? Or I'm just wondering if there's any negative effects on the mindset, knowing that there's like an intentional application system to attract a more diverse environment.
So you're asking me a question. I don't have any empirical data. So you want my opinion? If I give you, I'll give you my opinion, because I don't have. This is not. No, that is not necessarily what my study was about. Well, here's what we know about tests, and I'm going to use this to talk about test score logic, actually. My colleague, Sean Reardon, I heard him give a talk not long ago, and I think this will be published very soon, has found with 250 million pieces of test score data, all the tests under No Child Left Behind for every district in the United States, that there is a 0.85 correlation between the SES level of the school district and the mean test score outcomes. So 0.85, you just might as well substitute test for class, right? In an analysis at this point. That's pretty high. So when and under No Child Left Behind, which we now know as the Every Student Succeeds Act, school districts around the country, states are being given the ability to go to multiple measures to understand engagement, to understand outcomes, academic well-being. I actually think that's a good direction. I believe tests should be used for diagnostic purposes, for achievement purposes. In that way, for teachers to understand where students are not learning. I do believe that given the enormous impact of class, the association of class with test scores, the ability of some to be able to pay and afford for tutors and private test prep and all those kinds of things, or when you have parents who can expose you to the vast amount of cultural capital. My child is not even 2.5 years old yet, and he's been to Europe and all 10 or 15 states, and he'll probably, I don't know if he'll test well or not, but he probably will do okay. And I think that's a function of what you're exposed to. We're asking kids in this country to reach the proverbial floor 16, graduate from college. Some are on elevators going at the rate of a bullet train speed, a train going at the rate of a bullet. Some are on escalators moving very smoothly, not as fast as an elevator, and some are on stairwells with missing steps, no handrails, and they're all set to get there at the same time. And if they don't, that's an achievement gap. So my point is that we have to contend with those opportunity gaps. And if we can contend with opportunity gaps and keep kids engaged, there's a school in California, in San Francisco, a book just written about it, where 90+%, a large percentage, more than 3/4, go on to higher education, maybe not the finest colleges and universities. They're English language learners, they're deeply engaged, their teachers are highly committed, and they test in the bottom decile of the state. Do you deny those children, those youth, higher educational opportunity? In my opinion, no. Absolutely not. They're going to go on and do meaningful things in the world. And I would suggest to you that there are lots of people, perhaps some sitting in this room, who are thriving, and they didn't have stratospheric test scores. I'm one of them. So I don't believe, from a personal level, that tests matter. I believe what matters deeply is the deeper learning, good quality teaching, engagement, kids committed, and they're getting out of schools. And so what we're doing is we're comparing the statistically significant mean differences of groups, of people, and we're using it, and for some kids they feel stigmatized by that narrative, and they may even get derailed, but I hope most don't if your test scores are not that high. That's why I think the multiple measures should be meaningful in some ways. And there are several scores of universities and colleges now that are using the opt-out measure for testing. And I believe I read a study, I know I read a study that showed that the students who didn't submit test scores, that the people who did well in the first year of college were the people who showed strong engagement in high school, and the grades were a better predictor of the first year of college. So I want to suggest to you that this is not about being less than. It's really about context. Context matters. I've said a lot of things right there. You understand I'm very passionate about this. And now that I know with the full population of districts in this country that the correlation is that high, it just, for me, it undermines it in some ways. It's not to mean that tests don't matter in some ways, because we do need the diagnostic to know where the gaps are in terms of knowledge. But it's just too class-based. That's a pretty high correlation. Now, maybe I shouldn't have told that story. I told Sean that I mentioned that statistic all the time. It's coming out. It's his data. You'll know. So. He's the James Coleman of the 21st century at this point. Yeah.
You have a question?
Thank you, Dr. Carter, for coming. It's such an honor to have you here at the university. I'm an assistant professor in higher education, and a lot of what you discussed today and your findings echo a lot of what we see in higher education, especially for Black students and students of color, especially in predominantly white contexts and thinking about various contexts like minority-serving institutions. I wanted to ask, in terms of some of your findings regarding your construct of cultural flexibility.
Yes.
Some researchers in higher education, especially critical race theorists, talk about notions of self-preservation versus self-segregation, and so thinking about kind of love of self. And I saw your talk yesterday as well with Dr. Stovall, and just talking about the importance of just being able to love yourself as someone who's a student of color in these various contexts. I don't know if you had any thoughts on your connections and thinking about youth in these various contexts.
It's a very good question. Honestly, if I'm fully reflexive about what motivated me to do this study, probably 15 years after I had graduated from college, I would say that it made the seed that may have been planted for me. I went to Brown University. I'm a product of, I'm a proud Brown alumna. Loved my experience at Brown. But imagine going from the de facto segregated South, schools in the Mississippi Delta, to a place like Brown. Whoa, that first year. Affluence, people from all over the world. I didn't see any teachers. I had no professors who looked like me. One of the reasons I went into the professoriate, and it was happy to work in predominantly white elite spaces so that I could be that person I didn't have. But one of the things that I did see anecdotally, and this is observationally, I worried sometimes about my friends who had grown up and gone to high schools where they weren't empowered, didn't feel as empowered or assured. I struggled. The quality of my education in high school perhaps was not as rigorous as theirs, but there were certain things that were instilled in us around hard work, keep your head down, you can do it, that allowed me to be a lot, this is not self-aggrandizing, but I felt a little more resilient. And so that's part of the thing that laid the seed for me, was like, is there something, this is the social psychological piece about feeling like you belong in a place in your formative years that can actually boost you even as you endure hardship. And your psychologist in the room may be able to tell me this, because I'm no psychologist, but that's what I feel like this is indicating some in my research. And so yeah, when we got to Brown, and even today when I see students sitting at the table having the ethnic theme house of this and that, it's trying to find that safe space. What Dorothy Steele talks about, identity safety. She and her colleagues, and Claude Steele, this is the wife Claude Steele, my new soon-to-be boss, and they talk about identity safety, right? And I think that that does matter in some sense if you want to stay attached to an organization or an institution and want to be able to hold on. And so sometimes you don't get that from high school, so you try to build it in college. If you went to one of the high schools like North Village Prep or South County Prep, and that's why you build it in college. And I, on the other hand, had it in high school, so it actually afforded me the opportunity to go out like that, and my friends were from all over the world, because I was tired of being segregated. And so it actually created, but I also loved myself enough to be a part of that as well. So it's a fascinating, but that's a personal story. But sometimes the personal can actually lead to some conceptual insights, experiences. At least I think it might have for me, but let me shut up before I get myself in trouble.
At this point, I want to thank you all for your questions and for your responses. And will you join me in giving Dr. Carter a round of applause? You all are all invited to join us at the reception, which is right out